In this segment of worker mobility and migration, I'd like to begin to take a look at some immigration statistics. We could just as easily look at migration statistics, of which there are many available to us, but I want to start to form our discussion in this respect more about immigration than inside of a nation or inside of a state migration. I mean, we could be going from county to county or city to city or state to state, and many of the same concepts that we'll be discussing here apply, of course, but I'd like to end up forming a discussion, maybe even challenging an argument with respect to immigration. Immigration has become obviously a contentious issue in national politics, certainly in regional politics in some parts of the country. If you live in the Southern California market, you live in the Texas market, you live in the Arizona market, you're probably acutely aware of the effects of immigration on your market, and you may have developed some attitudes or maybe even reflect some institutional structures or ways of thinking about immigration that may or may not be accurate when you look at the bigger pictures. So we're going to look at a few of these things and see if we can't either reinforce some of those things that you believe or update your knowledges or maybe even challenge some of those things that you or others that you work with believe. So we'll do this as we talk about immigration statistics. Let's first take a look at the immigration levels over periods of years. So we're looking here from 1901 through 2000. And we see in this column the number of thousands of immigrants. So when we have 9,000 thousands, that is 9 million immigrants. We see a annual rate per thousand, so immigrants per thousands in the U.S. population. We then continue that on from 2000 to 2009. So we're relatively current here. And we can see that over this period, clearly in 2009, we had one of the higher levels of immigration that we've seen in the last decade. But when we think about the entirety of this decade, the 2000 to 2010, we're looking at 1, 2, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 7, 8, 9. We're looking at an immigration of roughly similar numbers as we saw in the prior decade of 91 to 2000. I didn't add up that column expressly. You can do that, but it's going to be relatively similar to the same number, 9,000, 9,500 thousands, so 9,500,000 that we saw within the decade of the 90s to 2000. All this means is we have had for 2 decades a relatively constant stream of immigration. It's interesting, if we think about our immigration in 2006, 2007, 2008, we did see a small uptick from 2005 to 6. The U.S. economy was getting very strong. There was a lot of motivation to migrate to the U.S. economy from other economies, certainly from South American and Central American economies where the economy was weak, but also many other economies around the world. But in the midst of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2009, we saw that number fall from a peak of 1,266,000 in 2006 to a low of 1,052,000 in 2007. And it bounced back to about 1,100,000 in 2008, 2009. As the U.S. economy has continued to improve in 2010, 11, 12, and 13, we see this number strengthening yet a little bit still. I don't have those data points available to me to share with you at the moment. But we see that over time, immigration has been strong in this country. We saw significant levels of immigration in the earliest decades of the 20th century. And not surprisingly, we saw those fall dramatically. We saw them fall first in the decade going into 1920 and then again into 1930. This would be a byproduct of World War I. And as it turns out, when a nation is at war with other nations, we don't have a lot of immigration coming in from those nations. And the immigration we saw into the United States in the earliest part of the 20th century was largely immigration coming in from Western and Eastern Europe. That curtailed rapidly as we went to war in those parts of the world, and then we had a world war. That then fell dramatically further as we entered World War II, which was a war not just within Europe, but also was now a war in Europe and Asia, and really spread across the globe, North Africa, etc. We then began to see immigration ramp back up again in the 1940s, excuse me, and continue its trend, increasing trend through the 2000s. As we consider immigration, we need to consider the immigration by age level. So at this point, we're now looking at migration levels rather than immigration levels. This is moving from state to state. And we're looking not expressly at age levels here, but we're looking at education levels. And we see that those with less than a high school education, high school diploma, we saw between 2000 and 2005, we saw a migration for these people ages 30 to 34 with these education levels of 14.7%. Those with a high school diploma, we saw migration at 11.9%. These are moving out of their states of origin. Of the 13 to 15 years of education, which would be college, not college graduates necessarily, but those that are attending some higher education, 13.2%. Those with a bachelor's degree, presumably at 16 years of education, so high school plus 4 years, is 17.6%. And those with a 17% or more, we see 27.3%. Please excuse my coughing, I apologize. We see 27.3%. What this tells us is that we have our highest levels of migration, and you'll see commensurate, we have our highest levels of formalized and legal immigration when we have higher levels of education. That tells us that those with higher levels of education, those with higher levels of skill sets, will go to other places being able to, or believing that they can capitalize on value-added activities, higher value, higher productivity markets. We also see the lowest of skill sets, the less than a high school diploma, seeking to do this, to go to another location. And that's probably a factor or a function of the very low-skilled will try to move to other markets simply that have better wages, perhaps not considering that those markets also have higher costs of living. As we look a little bit further at immigration statistics, we need to consider the earnings of different immigrants as a percentage of native earnings in different decades. So as we're looking at this graphic, we see on the y-axis, we see the percentage immigrant earnings as a percentage of the native earnings. So if we're looking at immigrants in the U.S., we are looking at the percentage that the immigrant population earns of that which is earned by the domestic population. So in 1970 and 79, based upon the number of years that these people are in the United States, we see that we have a relatively high curve that starts off higher, it comes through, stagnates at around 80% when someone's been here 10 or 15 years, but then moves upwards to 85% or so as the individual's been here 20 years and more. In 1970, 1979, that curve starts off at a lower level, but is pretty much monotonically increasing. It doesn't stagnate. As we get out to about 15 or 18 years, it's flattening off, but it's continued to go upwards. And so that was a good decade to be an immigrant in the United States. 1980 to 1984, so clearly more than a decade, starts out much lower than either 1960s and 1970s, but has a much more rapid growth trajectory. We have a rapid increase from 0 to 5 years, little bit of flattening as we go from 5 to 10 years, and a little more flattening as we go from, looks like 12 to 15 years, give or take. And in this case, it takes a long time for the immigrants in that 15-year period to approach the incomes of the wages of immigrants that have come and have been in the United States for similar periods of time in other decades. This is likely a reflection of deregulation. It's likely a reflection of the number of immigrants that we've had coming into this country in those years. Recall that the 1960s were right after the Korean conflict. This was the midst of the civil rights movements. This is the midst of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. The 1970s, this was a period in which we were in the early part of the 70s, late part of the 60s, entrenched in the Vietnam conflict. We had significant political unrest in this country. This was the period of time when President Nixon resigned rather than be impeached. This is a period of time where we began to see some pretty significant inflation. We saw the OPEC oil embargo during this period of time. So inflation in these periods would also cause wages to rise, which might be part of what we're seeing here in this higher curve for the 1970s for immigrant wages as a percentage of native earnings. We then see a period of significant deregulation, lots of immigration in the 1980s, early 1990s. Some of this legal, some of it not. And when we think of this level of deregulation, we think of capital mobility. When I'm talking about deregulation here, I'm talking about globalization. We see the barriers of globalizing coming down. We see the ability to move capital from one nation to another very easily, move production from one nation to another very easily, move investment very easily. But also we see the ability of moving human capital and labor units from one nation to another very easily. As we think about this, we have to consider those who are most and least likely to migrate or to immigrate. And this, as it turns out, is going to be consistent whether it's state-to-state migration or if it's international immigration. The very young, those less than 17 or 20 years old, of their own accord are less likely or amongst the least likely to migrate. We presume that this is because they're far more dependent upon their social and familial networks in their domestic nations, their home nations. We also suppose this is because they haven't developed the resources or the wherewithal to afford the migration. Similarly, we find that older workers, older citizens, are very unlikely to migrate. For those, the psychic cost of familial and social networks, of their own surroundings, are very limited. But also, remember that for older workers, there's probably little upside to immigration if they're seeking higher levels of wages. It's harder to get good wages if you're entering the job market as an older worker or coming to a new job market as an older worker. It's also challenging to think about only having wages for a very short number of years. If you're 60 years old, you don't have a 40-year career sitting in front of you. So that makes it a little bit difficult. High school graduates and those that have just barely have that level of education are amongst the less likely to migrate. Interestingly enough, as we saw in a prior part of this segment, those with less than high school educations are more likely to migrate than those with just a high school diploma. Heads of households are less likely to migrate or immigrate. That's likely a function of the cost of moving the entire household, or the cost, much of it being a psychic cost, a social cost, of leaving your spouse perhaps or your children in your home nation as you go to a new nation or a new state perhaps for a period of months or years to establish yourself and be able to afford to bring them with you. Let's think briefly then about wages by generation of immigrant households. This is rather interesting. So we'll look at a graphic, we'll form a graphic where we have some level of earnings, wages, on the y-axis and some level of time on the x-axis. And we'll use different colors to denote different generations of immigrant households. Let's use black to consider the trend line for wages of first-generation immigrants. Well, actually, let's use black to identify the native-born. I see that I've noted that first in our bullet points. So the native-born, I think we would recognize, start out at a relatively low level of earnings, but it's a relatively steep curve. and that probably flattens out by the time someone is in their 50s or early 60s, and then as workers end up in their 60s and 70s, that probably has declined rather a lot. So this black line will be the native-born. So the native-born workers. These are ones that are acculturated to our society. They're not immigrating. Well, what does this look like compared to a first-generation immigrant? Well, I think that we would agree at the very least first-generation immigrants start out with meaningfully lower wages. And I think we would agree that the trend line for increases in those wages probably isn't as steep, flattens probably earlier, and declines more rapidly as they become meaningfully older. So this is the first-generation immigrant. Interestingly enough, the third-generation immigrant represents a very different picture for us. The third generation, or the second generation, not third, excuse me, the second-generation immigrant will start out with a higher wage level than the first generation. So we have to first think about why that is. The second-generation immigrant probably has the same surname or a similar one, probably has the same color of skin, probably has many of the same cultural attributes, but one of the things that the second-generation immigrant has that the first generation likely does not, or at least doesn't soon, is they almost certainly speak English. They almost have a command of the domestic language. So if they've come to the United States, they probably speak English more fluently. In fact, not only do they speak English, they probably speak 2 or maybe even 3 languages. They speak their native language, they speak English, and they maybe have even picked up another language along the way as they've been in domestic schooling, U.S. schooling, or as they've been so closely associated with other ethnic groups in maybe the neighborhoods or the regions that they've lived. Interestingly enough, we also find that even though this group of workers starts out at a lower wage, their trajectory of their wage is meaningfully higher, it's meaningfully more rapid, and they end up on a trajectory that places them with a higher level of wage on average than the native-born. So why is that? Well, we believe that that's because the first-generation immigrant household is so keenly aware of the investment, the costs, the sacrifices that they've made to come to this new land. We think still sometimes of the U.S. as being a land of opportunity. That opportunity might have diminished somewhat over the years, but compared to other countries, we still are an extraordinary opportunity for immigrant workers. And we know that this is a land in which even an immigrant worker can become meaningful. They can open their own business. They can have great wages. They can innovate. They can be highly educated. Some of these things would never have been available to them in their native countries. And so the first generation that has brought them here has reinforced over and over again. And we find that the second generation immigrants in these households tend to study more. They tend to have better work habits. They have usually very strong health habits. Oh, clearly there are some pockets within different parts of the country and different cities that we don't see this readily, but on average we see this. One of the interesting statistics that we have to think about is that the percentage of new business startups by immigrant households is far greater than the percentage of new business startups by domestic households. Not the raw numbers, because there are so many more domestic households, but the percentages. And so we see a lot of innovation taking place. We see households that have disjoined themselves, if you will, from their original social networks, everything they were used to. So everything is new. Everything is an innovation to them, if you will. So interestingly enough, let's think again about yet another group, and that group is going to be the third generation. Not the first, not the second, not even the native born expressly, but the third generation immigrant worker. Well, perhaps not surprisingly, the third generation immigrant worker is going to be virtually synonymous with the native born. And why is that? Because the third generation immigrant worker is native born. They are now 3 generations in our country, or whatever country they're in. They've picked up the society, the culture, the language, the habits, the institutions so effectively that they are native born workers now. So they've gotten well beyond the detrimental effects of first generation, but they've left behind some of the beneficial effects of second generation as they've entered this third generation space.